want to work with the United States in peace and security within the region, because we are committed to that. And we just want to thank you so much for this opportunity.
Well, thank you. And such good English, such beautiful. Where did you learn to speak so beautifully? Where were you educated? Where?
Yes, sir.
In Liberia.
Yes, sir.
Well, that's very interesting. It's beautiful English.
Sure.
They smiled on the red carpet, but beneath the tailored suits and diplomatic handshakes was betrayal. Not the kind done in secret, but the kind televised in high definition. There they were, presidents of nations rich in gold, uranium, oil, smiling like schoolboys before a headmaster, standing before Trump not as equals, but as clerks of a forgotten empire, pitching resources, offering land. One even offered to build a golf course. And as the world watched, one question began to haunt us. When did we stop acting like leaders and start performing like beggars? This isn't just another summit. This is the moment Africa must look in the mirror, because while the stage was set in Washington, the real battle for dignity, for direction, is still unfolding. If you're tired of the same script, stay with us. This story is not what you think. They called it a commercial opportunity. July 9th to July 11th, 2025. For 3 days in Washington, Donald Trump hosted leaders from Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Mauritania, and Senegal, nations bursting with resources yet still shackled by dependency. The red carpet was rolled out. Cameras flashed, and one by one they spoke. Not of self-reliance, not of Pan-African cooperation, but of phosphate, uranium, oil, bauxite, lithium. And always the same refrain: we are not poor, we just need partners. But these were not partnerships. These were performances. Each president reciting a sales pitch more eager than the last, as if Africa's greatest dream was to become a subcontractor in its own house. Trump barely needed to negotiate. He listened like a king being serenaded, amused, unthreatened, in control. And somewhere far from this summit of polished words and polished shoes, one man was silent. One man did not attend. The cameras didn't catch him that day. But the absence of Captain Ibrahim Traoré would speak louder than any speech delivered in Washington. And so begins the real story. Not in Washington, but in the silence of a man who chose not to perform. They called it a summit. But what unfolded that day in Washington looked more like a scene from a colonial auction block. One by one, Africa's presidents approached the podium not to assert dignity, not to declare vision, but to offer their nations piece by piece like vendors in a dying marketplace. Gabon's president Brice Clotaire Oligui Nguema was first. He waved a list of resources like a desperate merchant. We have manganese, uranium, oil. We are not poor, we just need partners. Partners. No, Mr. President. What you described was not partnership. It was an open sale. You offered Gabon's birthright not with pride but with palms wide open. You did not speak of refining uranium in Libreville. You did not dream aloud of training engineers or building industries. You simply handed over the keys and hoped the buyer would be kind. Then came Senegal's Prime Minister, his tone even more embarrassing. We have phosphates and a beautiful coastline. Perhaps, Mr. Trump, you might consider building a golf course in Dakar. A golf course. At a summit on investment and economic strategy, while African youth die crossing the sea in search of opportunity, while families go hungry beside soil rich in resources, you offered a billionaire a golf course. What kind of desperation or delusion leads a leader to measure national potential by the number of sand traps and seaside holes? Next came Mauritania's Mohamed Ould Ghazouani. He spoke of uranium, of lithium, of strategic coastlines. But his speech barely began before Trump interrupted him, impatient, dismissive, like a man late for a lunch he actually cares about. Maybe we can speed this up. We've got a full schedule. And yet, not one African leader walked away. Not one called it out. Not one said, we are not here to audition. Instead, they adjusted their ties, smiled wider, and kept selling. Liberia's Joseph Boakai came next, draped in polite gratitude. We are longtime friends of the United States. We simply ask for help to survey our minerals. There is iron, there is peace. We welcome your involvement. Survey our minerals. Mr. President, what were your ancestors buried under? Who tilled the land, who mined the hills, who lived for generations upon that soil? You don't need a foreign company to tell you what's in your land. You need courage to say, this time we'll process it ourselves. And then came Guinea-Bissau's Umaro Sissoko Embaló. Just last week he was in Beijing, cozy with Chinese investors. Now he stood before Trump like a man switching jerseys mid-game. We also have bauxite, we also have phosphates. Guinea-Bissau is open to American investment. No shame, no vision. Just a desperate race to the bottom. This was not a summit. It was an auction, not a forum of equals, but a stage of suitors where each African leader bent lower than the last, hoping to catch the gaze of a Western benefactor. And in that room, every handshake became a question mark, every smile a shadow. What happened to us once Africa stood for something? Kwame Nkrumah dreamt of unity. Thomas Sankara called for self-reliance. Patrice Lumumba died rather than kneel. But here in the capital of our former enslavers, our modern-day leaders knelt gladly. Not because they were threatened, not because they were coerced, but because somewhere along the way they began to believe we cannot rise on our own. And that belief is more dangerous than any foreign military base. That belief is what sells nations by the barrel and the ton. That belief is what turns billion-dollar contracts into broken roads. That belief is what makes a man offer his land for a golf course and call it strategy. Meanwhile, the world watched, China watched, Russia watched, but more importantly, Africans watched. Farmers in Mali, students in Nigeria, miners in Guinea, mothers in Senegal. They watched their presidents, the men who swore to protect their nations, turn into marketers of other people's futures. And in their eyes, a new fire began to burn, because for every leader who begged that day in Washington, there is a generation no longer willing to beg, a generation that sees through the words like trade, not aid, a generation that knows that win-win partnerships often mean Africa loses twice. They are asking questions now, dangerous questions. Why don't we process our gold at home? Why is our oil refined abroad? Why are our leaders still pitching Africa like it's up for lease? Why are we still applauding men who sell our future for headlines? And above all, where was Traoré? The cameras panned the room. He was not there. His name was not on the list. And yet, in every awkward pause, in every empty phrase, in every hollow promise, his absence screamed. Because while they were selling Africa, he was somewhere building it. Not perfect, not polished, but not for sale. He wasn't in Washington. There was no seat labeled Burkina Faso, no prepared remarks, no red carpet, no handshake with Trump, no golf invitation. And yet, his presence hovered over the room like a storm waiting to break. Because for all the deals being whispered, for all the resources being offered, for all the smiles wrapped in submission, there was silence about the one man who refused to kneel, Ibrahim Traoré, the captain from Ouagadougou, the boy soldier who once lived on UN rations, the president who now moves without apology, without Western permission, and most dangerously, without asking for help. While others beg for partners, Traoré is building state-run gold refineries. While others invite foreign companies to survey their minerals, he has kicked out French mining corporations and replaced them with public cooperatives. While others offer beachfronts for golf courses, Traoré is planting cassava and sorghum where tanks once rolled. And while the presidents of West Africa were reading bullet-point pitches to Trump, Traoré was standing in dusty fields, handing tools to former fighters, telling them, "You will now defend this land by feeding it." There is something unsettling about a man like him. Because in a world where leaders are trained to speak English before they speak sovereignty, Traoré speaks in silence through action. And in rooms like the one in Washington, that kind of leadership is terrifying, not because it is violent, but because it is contagious. Because Traoré doesn't just reject foreign domination, he makes it look obsolete. He doesn't just talk about dignity, he builds it brick by brick with military discipline and farmers' humility. That's why they don't mention him. That's why they smile harder, pitch louder, distract deeper. Because deep down they know, if Traoré succeeds, if Burkina Faso becomes truly independent, if his model spreads, then what excuse will they have left? What will justify the mansions built on aid money? What will excuse the loans signed in the name of progress but paid in sovereignty? What will they say to their people when the poor country of Burkina Faso, landlocked and battered, starts exporting refined gold and processed oil? Traore's absence is not a void. It is a mirror. A reflection of what real leadership could look like and what most have refused to become. They mocked him at first. He's just a captain. He's young. He'll be overthrown. He doesn't understand economics, and yet here he stands. While presidents shuffle from summit to summit, Traoré stays home and builds. No ceremonial parades, no million-dollar conferences. Just men in uniform digging trenches for irrigation. Just mothers receiving medicines no longer blocked by bureaucrats. Just schools rising from the red clay funded not by the IMF but by nationalized gold. You see, it's easy to dismiss a man like Traoré when you don't want to feel guilty. It's easier to call him radical than to admit you've become a coward. Because if you take him seriously, if you accept that what he's doing is possible, then you have to ask yourself, what have I been doing all these years? And that is a question too dangerous for comfortable men to answer, so they ignore him. Or worse, they plot against him. Behind the smiles and agreements in the same halls of power that once erased Sankara and Lumumba plans are already being drawn. Discredit him, sanction him, replace him if necessary. But they're learning something dangerous now. This time the fire is not in one man. It's in the people. In Mali, youth chant his name. In Ghana, students quote his speeches. In Niger, villagers have begun refusing foreign aid unless it comes with respect. Because Traoré didn't just walk away from the old system. He made walking away look righteous. And that is what scares them. That's why his absence in Washington felt so loud. Because it forced the room to ask a question none dared speak. What if we're the ones on the wrong side of history? What if leadership means sacrifice, not salesmanship? What if sovereignty isn't granted by summits but taken with quiet resolve? What if dignity cannot be negotiated, only defended? And what if this 35-year-old captain, this soldier with calloused hands and iron eyes, is not just a Burkinabe phenomenon, but the beginning of something continental? That's the fear echoing in the polished silence of Washington. And that's the hope rising from the dust of Ouagadougou. Because in a world full of speeches, he remains a sentence none of them can complete. And for millions watching from Soweto to Dakar, that silence speaks more than any summit ever could. If you've ever felt that African leadership should mean more than contracts and conferences, stay close. Because the next part of this story will challenge everything you've been told about realism strategy and playing the game. They call him a threat. A strong man, a destabilizing force in West Africa. They say he's dangerous. But to whom? Not to the farmers who now have tools in their hands. Not to the mothers whose children no longer die from preventable diseases. Not to the girls walking freely into schools that never existed before. So again, dangerous to whom? Not to Burkina Faso. To them. To the very system that told the world, you can't succeed without us. You can't rise without our loans. You can't think, act, or build unless we approve. And yet here he is, expelling French troops, closing down foreign military bases, launching a new regional alliance AES with Mali and Niger, speaking beside Putin in Moscow, welcoming diplomats from Cuba, Venezuela, Iran. And doing it all without apology. That's not instability, that's independence. And for a system built on control, independence is the greatest threat of all. So now they ask the world, how long can Traoré last? What's his endgame? Is he even realistic? But maybe it's time we ask a different question. What if he's not the problem? What if he's the measure? Because when a room full of African presidents sells uranium like candy and begs for golf courses, and one man says no more, we have to ask who really lost their mind. Was it Traoré who chose to face isolation, sanctions, and the wrath of empires in order to defend his nation's dignity? Or was it the others who smiled for cameras while trading sovereignty for short-term smiles? Let's be honest. They will say Traoré is being naive, that he doesn't understand how the world works, that real change takes time, diplomacy, compromise. But how long is long enough? 60 years of independence and we still export raw ore and import refined humiliation. We still sign contracts we don't understand. We still call investment what is really extraction. So, what exactly is realistic? Is it realistic to sell bauxite for pennies and buy back aluminum at 10 times the price? Is it realistic to have soldiers trained in Europe while schools at home crumble? Is it realistic to keep begging for aid while our youth drown in the Mediterranean? Maybe the problem is not that Traoré is too radical. Maybe the problem is that we've become too comfortable with failure. We've normalized dependence. We've learned to manage poverty instead of fighting it. We've turned survival into strategy and called it pragmatism. But there's nothing pragmatic about handing over your land. There's nothing wise about negotiating from your knees. And there's nothing modern about acting like clerks of empire. So again, who is the outlier here? The man who says Africa must process its own gold. Or the ones who say, let us build you a golf course if you invest. The man who says no more foreign bases on our soil. Or the ones who still measure sovereignty by the number of military parades sponsored by France or the US. We are told he'll fail. Just give it time. But what if the real fear is that he won't? Because if Traoré succeeds, if Burkina Faso becomes a working example of true independence, then the entire lie collapses. The lie that says Africa is too corrupt to manage itself. The lie that says we need oversight advisors, military cooperation, and donor conferences. The lie that says sovereignty is dangerous. If Traoré makes it, that lie dies. And so they must try to bury him before he proves them wrong. But this story is no longer about Traoré alone. It's about you. Because in this moment, Africa is being asked a question that no one wants to answer. Do you want freedom or familiarity? Do you want to chart a new path, uncertain, difficult, but your own? Or do you want to keep walking the old road paved with conferences, grants, and borrowed pride? Because the truth is, you cannot have both. You cannot demand sovereignty while outsourcing your strategy. You cannot shout Africa rising while crawling for validation. You cannot lift the people if your hands are tied to foreign approval. And that's why Traoré scares them. Because he forces the question we've avoided for decades. What is leadership if not sacrifice? Not sacrifice of the people, but by the leader. Not sacrifice of vision, but sacrifice of comfort. The willingness to lose praise in order to earn respect. That is the storm Ibrahim Traoré represents. A young man who refuses to believe that realism means giving up. A soldier who chose farming over foreign trips. A president who would rather be alone than be a puppet. They want you to believe he's mad, because the alternative is that we've all been asleep. So ask yourself, who do you fear more, the man who says Africa can stand, or the men who have proven they prefer to kneel? The time for pretending is over, because history won't remember who negotiated the best deal. History will remember who said enough, who broke the script, who tore the contract, who dared to believe that dignity was worth more than diplomacy. And if that man is standing in Ouagadougou, then maybe the rest of us should be standing beside him. Africa stands at a crossroads. One path is wide and familiar. It is paved with embassies, loan agreements, photo ops, and polite applause. It promises development but delivers dependency. It says partnership but means ownership without accountability. On this path, leaders attend conferences, but not farms. They speak fluent diplomacy, but not local dialects. They host foreign troops, while local youth rot in overcrowded jails. This path has been walked for 60 years. It has led us to roads that crumble after the ribbon cutting, to hospitals without medicine, to schools that teach obedience more than truth. And still they tell us, just keep walking, just be patient. But the other path is different. It is narrow, rough, not lit by international headlines, but by the fire of conviction. On this path, sovereignty is not a speech, it is a discipline. Aid is not refused out of pride, but out of principle. Because true dignity cannot be imported, it must be built. This is the path that says, let us process our own gold, even if it takes 10 years. Let us train our own doctors, even if we make mistakes. Let us own our failures so we can own our future. This path is walked by nations like Mali and Niger, now refusing to be military pawns. By Ghanaian youth demanding control over lithium exports. By ordinary citizens turning down donations that come with strings. And at the center of this second path walks Ibrahim Traoré. Not perfect, not easy, but free. This is not just about policies, it is about identity. Because in the end, the question is not which path is easier. The real question is, which path belongs to us? Africa must choose. Not just its leaders, but its direction. its soul. Now is the hour of choosing. No more waiting. No more panels, no more summits, no more carefully worded communiques, because this is not just about Burkina Faso. This is not about Traoré alone. This is about who we follow and who we become. You've seen the choice. On one side, presidents who offer uranium like party favors, who measure national worth in barrels and bauxite sold to the highest bidder, leaders who smile wide in Washington while villages back home starve silent. And on the other side, a soldier in dusty boots planting cassava with his people, refusing to trade dignity for deals, building quietly not for applause, but for legacy. So ask yourself, who would you rather follow into the storm, the man with the perfect accent and the foreign-trained economists, or the man with calloused hands who says, "We will rise even if we must build it stone by stone"? Because in the end, Africa doesn't need managers. It needs generals, men and women who fight not with bullets, but with integrity, who defend not just borders, but purpose. And today, in a world tired of empty speeches, Traoré is not just standing, he's marching. So either you walk beside him, or you step aside for those who will. Let the donors panic. Let the old alliances tremble. Let the media call it madness. But if standing up for your people is madness, then maybe that's the kind of madness Africa needs. So choose your general. Choose the one who builds without begging, who speaks without permission, who leads without compromise. Because the future is not written in boardrooms. It is written in the blood of the brave, the patience of the poor, and the courage of those who finally say, "This land is ours, and we will rise with or without your approval." Amen. If you believe it's time for Africa to stand on its own feet, not just survive but lead, then let your voice be heard. Comment, share, subscribe. Be part of the spirit of Africa. Because this movement is not about one man, it's about us all.